Okay, welcome back. And today we're going to finish the lecture on painting. If you remember in Unit 5, the art medium that we were discussing was painting, but I mentioned how because painting is so large in terms of like occupies so much of art history and also so large in terms of like all the different kinds of painting that I felt like it was best to kind of split up painting. And so painting is in two lectures. The first lecture was on the three most ancient forms of painting, which was fresco and primarily on those three, fresco and encaustic, and then tempera. And with tempera, we talked kind of briefly about the relationship between tempera and oil painting. And then for this lecture, we're talking about the three more modern forms of painting: watercolor, gouache, oil painting, and acrylic. That's actually four, really, when you think about it. But I kind of think of watercolor and gouache as a set because they're very similar. As I mentioned in the first lecture, there's lots of kinds of paints and lots of kinds of painting, therefore, that we don't really discuss. We don't talk about casein, which has actually been a pretty important type of paint at various times of history, or some of the more modern forms of painting like alkyds and enamels and things like that. So, um, anything else I want to say? Oh, and so in terms of this lecture, in terms of what you need to know for painting, the most important stuff is the stuff that was already covered in the first unit, which was knowing what is a pigment, what is a binder, what is a medium, what is a solvent, and how, depending on the particular kinds of painting that we're talking about, the particular paint medium, um, the the binder and the medium might be the same thing. The medium and the solvent might be the same thing. Potentially, I'm trying to think of an example where the binder, the medium, and the solvent are all the same thing. Maybe there isn't one, but maybe there is. The pigment is always a separate thing, but binder and medium sometimes are the exact same thing. Like in oil painting, binder and medium are the exact same thing. Um, and medium and solvent are often the same thing. Like in watercolor, the medium is water and the solvent is water. Um, so, and then sometimes, in some forms, all three are different things. Okay. Um, all right, I think we're about ready to start. So we're going to begin with watercolor. And let's see if I can get my screen to move. There we go. Okay, so here's some looking at some of the oldest watercolors from the history of of Western painting. And watercolor fundamentally is more than just simply painting with pigment suspended in water. True watercolor comes from the pigment being mixed with gum arabic and then mixed with water. So there are like fresco painting is painting with pigment embedded in water, but it's not watercolor because it requires the existence of the the plaster wall to absorb the color and basically bind the color to the wall. It requires that plaster in order for it to work, right? And another way of saying it is that when you just mix pigment with water and mix it up real good and spin it around a lot, you get what's called a suspension, but not a solution. A suspension is when, you know, you mix it up and it looks like it's pretty evenly mixed, but then if you let it sit for a couple of hours, all that pigment's going to settle to the bottom, right? Whereas a true solution is when you stir it all up and you let it sit, and no matter how much you let it sit, it always stays mixed to that amount. So, so like salt water is a solution. And so with gum arabic, though, watercolor can become a solution, and you can mix watercolor with water, and then it mixes evenly because the way it's bonded with gum arabic, and then the way the gum arabic bonds with the water. So what is gum arabic? Oh, that's a good question. So gum arabic is it's a sap resin that comes from a particular kind of tree. It's called the acacia tree, and it's found almost entirely in North Africa. And it's from the sap of that tree that you make this gum. which is in a resin, and then you can use that to then bind with the watercolor. Okay, gouache is chemically almost exactly the same as watercolor. The binder is gum arabic. The only difference is that gouache, all the pigments come with some extra kind of filler, extra um, materials to help make the pigment more opaque and more flat. And one of the things that's interesting about both materials, watercolor and gum arabic, or watercolor and gouache, is they're both rewettable because of the nature of gum arabic. So, like, if you've ever seen a watercolorist, they might have a palette where they put out all their colors from their tube in their palette, and then in like each in a little compartment, and then they let it dry, right? Because then they can come back and re-wet it anytime they want, and it's exactly the same. Like, no matter how much it dries, once you re-wet it, it works exactly the same as before. Not many paints work like that, but watercolor and gouache do. But that means it functions that way on the palette, right? You can wet it, you have a section like whether it's a cake, right? Sometimes when you buy watercolors, you buy little dried cakes that fit into a little square on your palette. And or whether it's out of the tube and you just let it dry. Either way, when it's dried and then you re-wet it, you can paint with it. So that's true, but it's also true that it's rewettable on the paper so that you could work a passage. Let's say Turner had painted this and gotten all of this quite dark with, let's say, some Prussian blue, and then decided, no, I want the water here to be very luminous and like really feel like it's reflecting a lot of the light from the sky. And so you could just take your brush and go over that passage and get it all really wet and then come in with a sponge or like today, a paper towel. Turner wouldn't have had a paper towel available to him, but like something like a paper towel or a cloth, right? And you pull out the water and you're also pulling out the pigment and you can literally lift off paint and pigment off of your paper. Now it damages the paper, so a lot of watercolors try to avoid that way of working. But anyway, there you go. So gouache. So here we have two examples of gouache painting, and one, from Turner from the 19th century, and one is a 20th century example where Matisse would make these. He had a period where he was doing all these cut paper pieces, and so this is a cut paper piece, but it's gouache in the fact that all the color of the paper was all made by using gouache. He would just take papers and then mix colors and then roll the gouache onto the paper to try to get it as even as possible, and then let it dry. And then later he'd come back and he'd cut that and make the collages. So here are some contemporary examples of artists who use watercolor. And like you can see with Elizabeth Peyton, the way she's working, that she's very much playing with that aspect of watercolor, the way it re-wets. Like these sort of splotchy kind of effects are caused by the fact that like when you put one color down and then you put another wet color near it, it'll bleed into it and even soak and pull it and kind of so like that the one pigment might be pulled into another section of another pigment. Okay, I thought I had at least a contemporary use of gouache as well, but gouache is one of the things that has been predominantly used for it's been used for as a design color, like pretty much since about the 20s. It was standard in art schools for students to use gouache for color design assignments. And the reason is because gouache dries flat and almost exactly the same color as it was when it was wet, right? And like it's like you make the color, you put the color down, and you get pretty much the exact same color. So it's easier to do like color matching and stuff like that. Um, Today, because acrylics are so much cheaper, acrylics have replaced it, but acrylics are not as good in many ways. Number one, because acrylics do change a lot in their color from when they're wet to when they're dry. Okay, oil painting. So the fundamental way that oil painting works is that paint, the pigment, is mixed with linseed oil. but it is ground into the linseed oil. If you remember what we talked about in terms of solutions and suspensions, if you just take some pigment and stir it into linseed oil, you're never going to get a solution. You'll get a very weak suspension where the pigment will barely, like it won't look like it's mixed in with the oil at all, and it will settle out real easily. Whereas if you grind it into the oil, like press real hard, there's a tool called a muller, which is a glass, kind of looks like a grinding stone, right? Um, but it's flat, and you do it on glass, and you grind basically glass to glass, and the heavy pressure pushes the small particles to molecularly bond, um, and you get oil paint. How was oil painted invented? We're not entirely sure. We know it comes out of the tradition of tempera painting. We know it comes out of the Northern Renaissance. People like Hubert and Jan van Eyck, and the Merode Master, and some Robert Campin, some other artists like that. Um, but who exactly was the inventor? We're not sure. Jan van Eyck is the one usually credited, but that may just be because he was the most famous of all of them. Um, and it's like it was a slow kind of invention because what's the difference between doing painting where your starting ground colors are all tempera and then your finishing is all done in washes of oil, and those washes of oil have traces of pigment mixed into them, to actually, you know, every time you mix pigment with your oil, grinding it every time to make sure that it completely mixes. And then so that then you're really truly using oil paint. And then all the way to the point where you don't even start with the tempera to begin with. And there was an in-between stage where for a lot of artists, they started in tempera, they would just do the grisaille. They do this kind of like green, brownish kind of a terre verte under kind of drawing under painting that was mostly just to organize values and just to organize the composition. And they do that in tempera, and then they do everything else in oil. And then eventually people would do the underpainting only in oil, right? But so it was a bit of a transition, not like necessarily a clean break, but somewhere along the way, true oil painting was invented. So let's look at some of the greats of oil painting. Titian is um, one of the greatest oil painters of all time. Definitely the greatest oil painter of the Italian Renaissance, of the Renaissance, I would say. And here are like de Kooning is a great example of an oil painter who really embraces one of the things about oil painting that makes it different from a lot of other paint materials is because it dries a little bit slowly, and because with the oil it can stand up, it can kind of be thick if you want it to be thick. It encourages you to paint loosely and gesturally, and to just kind of like to find the fun of the way the paint kind of mixes with each other. And so we can definitely see that appreciation here in de Kooning's painting. And here's some other great painters. Richard Diebenkorn. We will see Richard Diebenkorn a number of times. I think we've already seen a couple of images from him along the way. This might be the very first Hans Hofmann we've seen. Both of these, I love both these paintings, and both these are amazing, fantastic uh, painters and fantastic examples of oil painting. And here we have Van Gogh. We'll be seeing this. This will actually be on probably quiz number 3 this week, and will probably be on the final exam. We'll be seeing this landscape by Van Gogh. And I'm not necessarily making the case that this is the absolute best Vincent van Gogh landscape. I just particularly like this one, and I don't feel like you need to memorize Starry Night. I feel like a lot of the images that people generally gravitate towards with Van Gogh are a little bit more on the cliche side. And to me, his genius is more in the landscapes that are a little bit more about observing, and a little bit more about him really finding his voice and trying to figure out how his voice is going to react to and describe what he's seeing. Like Starry Night is a good example of where it's much more of a kind of it's an imagined image based off of memories rather than a observation based image. And is there anything I want to say? So yeah, we'll talk. We've already talked about this painting a little bit because of I think it came up in the first color lecture when we were talking about um, different kinds of limited color palettes. It's not truly analogous. Like I think I picked a different Van Gogh to represent analogous palette, but this comes pretty close in terms of how dominated it is by by greens and yellow greens. And yeah, we have seen this painting a number of times in various ways, and I once again love this painting. So oftentimes I like to when I'm talking about a different medium, I like to end by talking about a lot of contemporary artists and especially kind of focus on some contemporary artists that I know personally. So James McGarrell, I studied with in at St. Louis in the at Washington University, and um, James McGarrell is just an amazing painter, and he was a very interesting teacher. I learned a lot from him. Robert Barnes, I studied with in graduate school at Indiana University, and Robert Barnes and James McGarrell both knew each other. They actually, I believe, if I've got this right, they both were professors at Yale for a brief period of time, and and then they both moved on and basically founded art programs at different schools. So James McGarrell, not founded, but James McGarrell became the painter at Washington University, and Robert Barnes pretty much became the painter that the Indiana University system was founded on. He was so incredibly influential and important. And Jeffrey Haupt is a friend of mine. He used to teach at Mississippi State. We were actually colleagues for a while at Mississippi State, but he also, like me, went to Indiana University. So he also studied under Robert Barnes. And uh, he's one of those artists who has two very interestingly different, but also very successful bodies of work. He's kind of got this sort of Guston thing going on where his figurative painting, which he worked on for 20 years consistently, and then at a certain point he went to these more non-objective, I mean, they're figure-ish in that they are marks on a, there's always a sense of like thing on space, but they're definitely more like non-objective paintings. So here's some more examples of 20th century painting. And in terms of oil painting, but we do need to get to acrylic. And so acrylic, like it says, painting with plastic, and it is literally painting with plastic, right? Like the medium that you're using, or yeah, the binder in acrylic is essentially Roplex. There have been a number of different chemicals other than Roplex that are basically just different versions of Roplex. Roplex is the binder that's in house paint, like uh, and so um, and Roplex was the original binder of the original types of acrylics. Today we use slightly different, but it's essentially the same thing, which is, and it's a type of plastic that is in the form of these long strings. And then the way they bond is that the strings get all tangled together and then tighten up. And that's how it becomes a solid surface on the paint surface. And yeah, so here's a couple of examples. David Hockney's Big Splash is, or Bigger Splash is, probably one of the most famous early acrylic paintings. And a lot of people don't know that Mark Rothko did a lot of acrylic paintings, especially late towards his life and pretty much on paper. And what he's doing with acrylic is so different from what people tend to think are the, like, when people think of what acrylic is good at, people think that it tends to be really good at flat surfaces and very designy kind of color relationships. And what Rothko is doing is much more atmospheric and painterly, but part of that is because of the way he's working on a paper surface rather than on a canvas surface. He's working in layers and kind of like alternating between opaque layers and dry brushing with opaque layers, and then doing kind of a transparency layers. In a way, it's kind of interesting that Rothko found with acrylic to kind of explore the sort of paint surfaces that like Rubens did with oil paints. Like Rothko with oil paints really gravitated towards stains and then opaques over the stains, and that's it, and not kind of this back and forth. But Rubens had this like luscious kind of way of creating these surfaces that had like um, transparent paint and then opaque paint dry brushed over the top, and then that allowed to dry. Sometimes the drying took months, and then you'd have like a more transparent layer of paint over that, and then maybe even more like a dry brush layer over that, and then another layer of a stain or of a glaze. And that kind of process requires incredible patience because it means that sometimes you have to wait a couple of weeks or a month between layers before coming back. And I don't think anyone in the 20th century had that sort of patience. But Rothko kind of found that with a fast drying paint like acrylic, that he could come up with his own version of that. All right, and here are some examples of contemporary painters who I think are really sort of pushing the boundaries of what is painting. So Pia Friesa, um, and Angela de la Cruz, and where she turns paintings into works of sculpture uh, in beautiful ways. And Katerina Gross, um, who like who turns paintings into spaces or turns spaces into paintings. Um, they're just these amazing things. All right, and that's the end. Okay. Did anyone join me? Let's do a stop share. Looks like it was just me. All right, so I'm back to recording videos. I was off for a little bit because of the traveling and stuff, but I'm in South Carolina now, and I'll be recording, hopefully getting uh this is finishing Unit 6. I'll be maybe doing all of Unit 7, and but I actually might do parts of Unit 8 first before that. Okay, thank you very much. Bye.